Penn State International Relations, a master's degree from Oklahoma in Global Affairs, a minor in economics, and has been in banking finance for 6 years. Now he's a New York Times best-selling author and ghostwriter. He's currently working on a book titled The Africa That Can Say No. He is also co-host of a show called Contemporary Black Voices, a contributing writer in Black Life Texas newspaper. And family, please pick up the newspaper. It's an amazing article my brother has written. And he has spent over a decade researching and speaking on issues facing the African continent. Family, let's give my brother a strong, strong hand and welcome him. Brother Peter Alexander.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate that introduction. And I want to thank everyone for being here today. I know you could have been a lot of different places, so I do thank you. I appreciate you being here. I want to thank the Friends of the Carver for hosting this event. Shout out to Brother DL, who's always fantastic and always a great resource and a great asset. And so I guess I'll just kind of jump right into this a little bit. And I'll try to go through this as the slides kind of as quickly as I can. And so the only thing I would ask is that if you have any questions, if you can hold them till after I get through with the presentation. Other than, again, like Brother Ador had said, I'm working on a book called That Africa Can Say No. And so the premise behind this book is that Africa is able to say no based on its resources, based on its population. It's able to say no to a variety of things. One, it's able to say no to France. It's able to say no to neocolonialism. It's able to say no to the United States. It's able to say no to China. And it's able to say no to BRICS. And so, based on Africa's resources and Africa's population growth, they're able to go their own way. And so they don't have to choose between a Chinese overlord or an American overlord. And so that's kind of the premise for this book. And so the book is kind of divided into 3 phases. One, it's going to talk about the resources, Africa's immense resources. It's going to also cover Africa's tremendous population growth. And so a lot of you may be unaware, but currently 1 out of every 3 people that's born in the world today is born in Africa. And so by 2040, 1/3 of the world's global young working age population is going to be African. And so what China was to the last 40 years, that growth, Africa is going to be for the foreseeable decades to come. Their growth is not, it's not mitigating at all. It is not. And so with that being said, I'll go ahead and share. And so again, just a little bit about what I've talked about, the Africa that can say no. And then again, it's based on Africa's resources, Africa's population. And the third thing is also based on African unity. And what would an African federation entail when you combine the volume of resources that those countries have? What would something like that look like? And so there's also, and the reason I bring this up also is because there's been talk of federation. And I know there's been, in the news lately, there's been a rash of coups in Africa. And a couple of the young leaders who have taken power have honestly begun to talk about a federation. And so this is something that is not really, it's not in the realm of impossibility. Okay, that's the cover. And so this is where the name of the cover came from. It came from this book that was written in the 80s, titled That Japan Can Say No. And so if you remember the 80s, the U.S. had just come off of an oil embargo. It was a global oil embargo, and everybody was, the gas prices had everyone shook globally. We were shocked. And so everyone turned and wanted fuel efficient Japanese cars. And so Japan began to dominate the automotive industry globally. Everyone ran out and got their Suzuki, the Suzukis and the Toyotas and the Hondas. I know when I was growing up, everybody my age wanted a Suzuki Samurai. So if you had a Suzuki Samurai, you were one of the cool kids. And so everybody, and so we had the 280 ZXs and the 300 ZXs and all those cool cars. And so that they kind of dominated the automotive industry at that time. And so another thing is, if you remember the 80s, you remember Atari and Nintendo and all of the Japanese toys that came out. So they really dominated in that area. They were dominating in the area of semiconductors and just really manufacturing, dominated global trade. So this is before the rise of China. And so a group of Japanese citizens, one of them was a part of the Japanese parliament, which they call the Get. The other one eventually was the president of Sony at the time. So this group, they got together, and one of them eventually became the mayor of Tokyo. So they got together and wrote this book, because Japan was they were kind of feeling themselves at that time, right? And so they were saying Japan can say no to the US. And so that was the premise for this book, and it was the reason for the title of my book, that Africa can say no. And so ours is not based on manufacturing, but it's based on resources and population growth. And so again, we talk about Africa's natural resources. What are some of Africa's natural resources? So 90% of the world's platinum comes from South Africa. And so without platinum, you can't make high-strength steel, you can't make composite metals, heat-resistant metals, etc. 40% of the world's gold comes from Africa. 90% of the world's chromium, 70% of the world's cocoa beans, 40% of the world's manganese comes from South Africa, 65% of the world's diamonds, 70% of the world's phosphate reserves are located in Africa. So without phosphates, you can't make agricultural materials. You can't make fertilizer without phosphate. And so Africa also contains 66% of the world's arable land. And so as that comes into play as you start thinking about the expanding global population and the ability to feed billions and billions of people. And so with 66% of the world's arable land, Africa becomes even more critical when you're trying to feed that kind of global population. And again, these are just some of the resources. And as you see, there's everything. So without even me going down the line and listen, we'll just say everything. And here's another breakdown. The annual mineral production in billions and broken down by the countries and their dominant resources. Not all the resources in this country, but just their dominant exports for those countries. And so again, it's everything. And as far as the Democratic Republic of Congo, that's what they should have just listed. They should have just listed everything. And again, that is the hydropower. And so again, as we move into, and I do apologize, my slides got all mixed up. And so I was sitting up here trying to reorganize my slides, and so some of them may pop up in the wrong place. But this is talking about Africa's hydroelectrical potential. And so as you can see, they have a tremendous amount of hydroelectrical potential, the most in the world. And so when you talk about technologies of the future, energy of the future, Africa and their hydroelectrical power, and again, if you also take into consideration solar power, tremendous solar potential as well. And so as you talk about industrializing, that's where it's at. And so again, here Africa is poised to become a global supply chain powerhouse. And so basically what this article talks about is Africa's geographical location. And so they sit at the crossroads between, of course, Southwest Asia, Europe, right across the pond, you have South America, you have Brazil, and of course they have access to the Asian markets, India. And so just based on geography, it's set to become a global supply chain powerhouse. Also, because of what I just mentioned as far as the energy potential, and you kind of want to build factories where the resources are. It just makes more sense. So even the U.S. is establishing EV battery power plants. They're beginning to establish EV battery power plants in some of the nations that have some of the critical resources to manufacture EV batteries. Congo being one of them. Kenya is poised to become the Singapore of Africa. And so these next few articles just talk about Africa's potential and how the world views Africa's potential. Mineral wars. And so again, there is a scramble. The two key components of an electric vehicle are lithium and cobalt. And so in my previous slide, Congo exports 75% of the world's cobalt, and they contain about 66% of the world's hard lithium reserves. And so, everyone wants to eat from Africa's table. We're going to talk a little bit about exploitation. U.S. eyes chance to challenge China's dominance in key African trade corridors. So there's a global great power competition for Africa's resources, of course, between the U.S. and China, and of late Russia. 10 things to know about the U.S.-China rivalry. So did I push the automatic? So let me stop the automatic. Okay, and so I include this slide to show you that everyone is involved in this scramble. So it's not just the U.S. and China. Of course, you have Japan, you have Saudi Arabia, you have many nations around the world that are kind of involved in this scramble for African resources. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia in talks to secure metals in Africa. And so when I see articles like this, I have the gall of it, where you have the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are talking about Africa's resources. And so you'll see articles like this all the time, where the U.S. and China are negotiating about how to divide up and carve up Africa's resources. You'll see talks about Europe and about France and how they are in talks to divide up Africa's resources. And so it goes on and on and on. So the gall when I see articles like this. And so a little bit about, when we're talking about exploitation, we're going to talk a little bit about debt and destabilization. So I kind of want you to keep those two words in mind, debt and destabilization. And so those will come back after I continue through the presentation, because those are going to be the answer to the question, how? Okay? And so we know why, but those two words are going to answer how. And so, just to talk about, I just put a couple of little notes here. So, we're going to talk about the Dutch and their oil tariffs. And so, we're going to talk about how when an African country wants to develop or add value to their resources, one of the taxes that European countries use are tariffs. And so, in this case, Nigeria wanted to add value to their oil, and so they started to refine their oil, because of course you get more for refined oil than you do for crude oil. And so the Dutch are big importers of Nigerian oil. So Nigeria started to refine the oil and sell refined crude to the Dutch, and the Dutch placed a tariff on the oil that was so high that it was cheaper for Nigeria to just sell them crude oil again. So they prevented Nigeria from developing their own petroleum industry by placing enormous tariffs on their oil. And this was repeated by the Swiss. And so you all know, if you go to some of the finest hotels, or pretty decent hotels, you're gonna see Swiss chocolate on the bed. They got all these Swiss chocolate. They got all these Swiss chocolates on when you take a flight. And so Switzerland's known for their fine Swiss chocolates. But I guarantee you can search the deepest valleys in Switzerland and the highest mountains, and you will not find a single cocoa field. I promise you. And so we had some of the West African nations that tried to develop their cocoa industry, tried to add value by refining their cocoa. And what the Swiss did to protect Swiss industry and Swiss workers, they placed a tariff that was so high that it was just cheaper to just sell them raw cocoa beans. So again, that's how they prevent Africa from developing. They do it through, they're now debt servicing. They won't allow Africa to reservice their debt. They do it by denying African countries the inability to transition from cash crops to food staples. And so they have Africa so much in debt that they have to grow and export what the Western countries want them to grow and export, which means that they cannot, a lot of countries face food insecurities because they're so in debt that they have to develop crops for export, grow crops for export. And because they're so suffering from such a crushing debt, it's resulted in overuse and a destruction of the land. And so those are some of the tactics that they use to keep Africa in debt. And of course, if you can't grow your own food, you have to do what? You have to import it.
That's right.
And that's more debt. And so these are some of the debt traps that they use. And of course, there's the Wagner Group, which is over there. They are carting off every ounce of gold that they can find, whether it's in Central African Republic, whether it's in Mali. They're ransacking those the gold mines. And then of course you have the magic bullets. So I'll talk a little bit about the magic bullets a little bit later. We'll get to that. But just keep in mind those two words, debt and destabilization. Okay. And so what I do want to talk about is the World Bank, which is another tool that they use to destabilize Africa when we talk about debt. Okay? And so the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. And so I wanted to point this out to you because I just wanted to show you one of the things that the World Bank did. So South Africa they wanted a loan. This was, of course, after the post-apartheid transition period, they needed money. They wanted a loan. So one of the things that the World Bank does is if you need money, you want a loan, they make you privatize your industries, right? So you have to privatize your industries. You have to open those industries up. And another thing is they make you end subsidies to your farmers. So the U.S. is able to subsidize their farmers. Europe is able to subsidize their farmers, but they tell African countries you cannot subsidize your farmers. And so what that does is it creates a disadvantage. Because now America is able to dump cheap wheat, cheap crops, cheap corn into the African markets. And what that does is dumping those crops into the African markets, the African farmers can't compete. So they lose their farms. They go out of business, they lose their farms. And now they become dependent on Western food. And so that's another one of the tools they get. But the reason I point this out is because they made South Africa privatize their water and their electricity. And so a lot of people could not afford the $7 charge for water. And so what that resulted in, and forgive me, but my eyes. So what that resulted in was a cholera outbreak in South Africa. And so, it had a major effect. It was I want to say it was in the millions. 10 million out of South Africa's 44 million, 1/4 basically. they experienced water and electricity cutoffs because of the World Bank. And there was a massive cholera outbreak because of lack of access to clean water. And that's a World Bank policy that happened. And so I just wanted to point that out. The World Bank and the IMF is not Africa's friend. It is not. It's not a friend to any of the nations that they've come to start calling the Global South. They used to call it third world nations, but that became passe. So now they want to refer to poor folks as the Global South. Okay. And so, again, my slides got all scrambled. So this is again, we talked about the minerals of the future. I think I covered this. So 75% of the world's cobalt comes from the DRC, and it should be 60% of the world's hard lithium, 65% of the world's tantalum. And so tantalum is what they need to manufacture capacitors, motherboards. And so your motherboards are in everything: washers, dryers, microwave, your cars, everything has a motherboard. And so 65% of the world's tantalum comes from the DRC. So without the DRC, I don't think you have a microwave. And so here we go. And again, my slides got scrambled. So this should have been a little further back. And so the Biden administration commissioned a study on electric vehicles. Yes. And after the study, the official reported his findings back to the administration. And when presenting his findings, the official informed the president that electric vehicles were nothing more than 10 boxes with batteries. And when the president asked what was in that battery, the response was Africa. Africa is in that battery. And so again, this is just talking about the competition. And so they are really, every week well, not just a couple of times a week, when you go on the internet and you pull up your news sites, Yahoo News, you're gonna see articles about competition between US and China. And so they are really concerned. This is a real concern about the future, about what they call future minerals or future technologies. And again, cobalt being critical. And so again, U.S. eyes chance to challenge China's dominance in key African trade corridor. America has a problem in Africa, and it is China. Yep. And so, what is America doing? And so, basically, since Africa is getting all this attention from Washington, some of the African states are starting to court African Americans and to use us to help build those bridges and so this is another thing I just wanted to highlight when it comes to Africa. So what happened here is that they forced Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE forced Nigeria and Angola to cut their oil production. They forced them. They said, if you don't cut your oil production, we're going to dump oil on the world market, and we're going to starve you. And so Angola and Nigeria had to cut their oil production in order to allow the UAE to increase theirs. The UAE is already rich. They're rich. They don't need the money. Saudi Arabia doesn't need the money. But what they did was they forced Nigeria to cut their production so they can increase theirs. And so this was a part of another set of slides that I ended up taking out, but it was about Africa's friends. And so I put this in there to highlight that Africa has no friends.
Tell the truth.
And so we remember the you have no friends lecture. And so even Russia's involved in this, right? So facing off with the West on Ukraine, Russia reshapes world order in Africa. Right? Russia's controversial private army, which again we're talking about Wagner Group in Africa and what they're doing, and they're brutal. Make no mistake about it, they are brutal. A lot of people talk about Wagner Group and Wagner Group assisting some of the African nations in resisting the West or resisting France. But some of the things that Wagner Group has credibly been accused of in the Central African Republic are horrible. They're butchers. Kissinger. And so Kissinger at 100, how his sordid diplomacy in Africa fueled war in Angola and prolonged apartheid. And here we go again with the Russians. Putin has a dream. And that dream involves African gold. And again, Putin had another dream. And then he had another dream, part 2. And so I guess he kind of stays awake at night worried about African resources a lot. And so America has turned to its African American population to assist it in its competition against China. So now we are very, very valuable to the United States. So they're screaming for us to help them and use our history and our ancestry in their great power struggle for African resources against China. And so this again, my slides got outnumbered, misplaced. And so this was supposed to come later, but just this talks about Namibia taking control of some of its resources. And so this slide is supposed to be in a later section that talks about what Africa is doing, some of the things they're doing to fight back and take control of their own resources, take control of their own destiny. And so that slide was, again, it was out of place. And again, so we go back to the World Bank, okay? And again, the World Bank is not a friend of Africa. And so here's just a few things about the World Bank. Of course, it's based in the United States, but only the United States has veto power over what the World Bank does. No other nation does. And so again, the World Bank demands that poor countries stop subsidizing their farmers while the United States and Europe continue to subsidize theirs. So again, it's about creating an unfair advantage. It demands that other nations privatize their utilities, despite their populations not being able to afford basic needs such as water. And so I showed you the other slide where, because of that, there was a massive cholera outbreak. And so McNamara takes charge of the World Bank in 1968. Okay, and he basically transformed it. And so in the first 5 years that he was in charge of the World Bank, the World Bank financed more projects and loaned more money than it had during the previous 22 years combined. So in 5 years, under McNamara, it loaned more money than it had in the previous 22 years. And so, there's a reason for that. Back then, McNamara, I think I have a slide somewhere, but back then McNamara was I guess he would be considered the Steve Jobs of that era. He was like the Bill Gates, he was the golden boy. McNamara had run Ford, he had pulled Ford out of the gutter, basically, and he revived Ford. And so he was the golden boy of that era. He went over to the Defense Department. He revitalized the Defense Department, and so Johnson moved him over to the World Bank. And we see how successful that was. And so his move from the World Bank, again, it was the largest transfer of wealth from the global South to the global North. And so what they did was, again, it offered to large northern investors a new vision of the global South, commonly known as the Third World, untapped, unvalorized natural resources that could potentially fuel a tremendous growth spurt in the northern industrial output and profit. It has nothing to do with helping the South. It has nothing to do with helping poor countries. It was all about transferring wealth to the North, the countries of the North. It was all about transferring wealth to the wealthiest nations of the world. That's what the World Bank was about and is about. They called it, the World Bank called it the program of growth through redistribution, right? Redistribution. Theft by any other name is still, but they called it the program of redistribution. And so, true to his reputation as the U.S. best and brightest, brilliantly transforming Ford Motor Company, blah, 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 McNamara introduced the ideology of global expertise, right? By creating new production sites for data analysis and on borrowing countries and training in the analytical approach of World Bank style. It sounds fancy, doesn't it? And he's training them the idea of growth with redistribution. And so, all of that translates into this. The World Bank increased its commitment to train its own staff, members of borrowing state agencies, staff of NGOs, academics, employees, blah, 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 blah. So the World Bank wanted to train you. It wanted to train other countries' economists to put their countries in debt. That's what it did. It taught the world that debt is good. By training future leaders, the World Bank ensured that leaders and economists in the global South would continue to mortgage their country's futures. That's all that fancy language on that other page. We're going to train you to believe that debt is good. We're going to train you to believe that hawking your resources to us is good. If there's no back door, y'all remember that saying? If there's no back door, the World Bank we're training 48,000 people a year, economists, politicians, and everyone else, per year. In 2022 alone, they delivered 560 learning activities to more than 48,000 participants in 150 countries through collaboration with more than 400 partner institutions. Broad its reach to include everybody that controls the economies. So basically they're saying, we're gonna let you do the dirty work for us. We're gonna train your presidents, your policy makers, your economists to believe that debt is good. And that's probably the most lasting and damaging effect that the World Bank has had. Is training people to put their countries in debt and to mortgage their resources. And again, this slide is out of place. This other one. Debt destabilization. I mentioned this earlier, right? About the magic bullets. Where are they coming from? Where are the factories that are making all of this ammunition? So we know that there's a primer, there's a brass casing, right? We know there's gunpowder, there's a chemical. In order to make gunpowder, it's a chemical composition. It's pretty advanced chemicals. Copper shell, copper, brass. Where's the copper coming from? Where's the brass coming from? Where are all these factories in the middle of these jungles making all of this ammunition? How do you replenish RPG warheads in the middle of a war, in the middle of a jungle? Where's it come from? That's not easy to make. There's a cone with a shaped charge in it. Just the chemical composition of the warhead, of the explosive material in the warhead. Are you telling me that some kid in the jungle in northern Nigeria is producing this? So where's it, again, debt and destabilization? Where's it coming from? What are the two things that they're using to keep Africa from rising. We just talked about the debt part, the World Bank. Now we're talking about the destabilization part. Within 4 months of Russia invading Ukraine, they were out of ammunition. 4 months. After 4 months of war in Ukraine, Russia was using missiles that were designed to attack ships into buildings. They had run out of missiles, they had run out of bombs, they had run out of bullets, they had run out of everything. NATO has an ammunition shortage. I want you to say NATO, right? NATO has a shortage of ammunition. Someone who is designed and had stockpiles, decades of stockpiles to fight the Warsaw Pact, is out of ammunition to supply for Ukraine. But yet and still, you've had movements in the jungle, Boko Haram, for the last 20 years. You've had movements in Congo for upwards of about 40 years, but they haven't run out of ammunition. But NATO has an ammunition shortage after a couple of months. Russia is forced to reduce their attacks after running out of expending all their ammunition. It took Russia, again, 4 months. And so, again, my slides are out of place, but here we go, a new beginning. And so as the world transitions from fossil fuel powered vehicles to electric vehicles, new resources are needed to power those vehicles, right? So we covered this a little bit. And that's why Africa is becoming a bigger player in the global economy, resources and population. And so this is probably one of the most critical articles, again, this year that's come out. It's published in Foreign Affairs. It's not a liberal publication at all. And so what this article kind of talks about a little bit is that the world needs Africa. Okay? And the world is counting on Africa to be the next driver of global growth. What China was to the world for the last 40 years, Africa will be for the coming decades. By 2050, China will be climbed by 300 million workers. After 2040, India's prime age workforce will start to decline. By 2050, the prime age working population of Africa will be 5 times that of Europe and twice that of India and China combined. African youth will account for 98% of all the net labor force growth. China's rise had a lot to do with their population. There's a term that they call demographic dividend. Okay. And so they've been talking a lot about the demographic dividend because I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but back in March, India surpassed China as being the most populous nation in the world. China's one-child policy was very, very successful. And so India is now the most populous nation in the world. And again, that's going to start to decline. And United Africa will soon overtake India as having the largest population. Again, my slides are out of place, but this kind of goes into it in a little bit more detail, okay? And so in 2040, again, as a result, 1 out of every 3 people in the world between 15 and 24 will be African. By 2050, again, the prime age, I already covered that, 5 times that of Europe, and that. The entire world's prime age working population will increase by 428 million people between 2020 and 2040. Out of the 400, I want you to listen. Out of the 428 million increase, 420 million of them will be in Africa. The other 8 million will be divided amongst the rest of the world. So, let's see if I get that right. Currently, the population in Africa is already twice that of Europe with over 2.2 billion people. And so in this report, they also note that there's no global green economy without Africa's natural resources. That's on the bottom. And so some of the things that Africa is doing, they've constituted what they call the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is the largest free trade area in the world. And so the Continental Free Trade Agreement consists of 55 African countries, 1.3 billion people. It's larger in size and population than the European Union, and it's larger in size and population than the U.S., Canada, and Mexico agreement, which we used to be NAFTA. So it's larger in size and population. You remember the Public Enemy song? The album? All right. And so again, this is what we talk about. We talk about the demographic dividend. Okay. And according to the World Bank, Africa's fertility rate is twice that of the rest of the world. Today, 1 out of every 3 people are born in Africa. 2040, 1 out of every 3 people between 10 and 24 will be African. 1 out of 3. Between 20, and I already covered this, out of 420 million people, 420 million of them will be African. And again, I talked a little bit about this. India's, I think it was back in March, India surpassed China to become the world's most populous nation. And again, that's what you start hearing the term demographic dividend, which means by your population growth, it creates a vast domestic marketplace. And so, and I don't think I have this on the slide, but just to talk about what that means a little bit too, right? And again, they talk about because of India's growth, can India replicate China? And so again, Africa is projected to outpace Asia as the world's fastest growing region. And so again, here we go a little bit about what the future looks like. And I know you've seen this in the news. The coup in Mali. The coup in Burkina Faso. And again, my slides are out of place. And then, of course, there was a coup in Gabon. And there was a coup a couple of years ago in Chad. There's a coup in the Central African Republic. A lot of these coups are occurring in former French colonies. And so, and of course, there was a coup in Guinea. And so, of course, just to talk a little bit about the coups and what they mean, of course, they are about resources, okay? But I also want you to understand they're about demographics. And so, yes, France takes plenty of resources from Africa, and what resources they don't use, they resell to the rest of Europe. Of course, they control those nations' economies. Of course, you've heard that they require those nations to deposit their foreign currency reserves into the French treasury. But don't underestimate the power of demographics. Because as long as France maintains control of those countries, France gets to sell its goods to those countries. They get to control those markets. And so when you talk about the fastest growing populations, and you talk about this enormous demographic, and you look at the French economy, France gets to control those economies, and those countries have to buy from France. So it's more than just about resources, it's also about population and market. So another thing that they're doing is Congo, of course, is trying to buy back its resources. So again, we talk about what the countries are doing in the future. That's one of the things that Congo is doing, is trying to gain control of its resources by buying them by buying those bonds back. And of course, it's one of the cool about it. And this was part of another section I included, and it was about shortage of project managers. And so as part of this, infrastructure and project managers, and so I tell the story about how I went to go do a book one time on Julius and Thomas Jones, the two brothers that were in the NFL, and I flew out to Big Stone Gap, West Virginia, and what I saw in West Virginia while being taken around West Virginia, that whole entire area, the entire coal belt, I saw a massive community of black folks that were miners and engineers. And so I mention this just to say that we know how to mine, and we know how to form consortiums, and we know how to go and do business globally. And so we can and do have a role to play in Africa's development. That's right. Okay, so again, it's just talking about the coup. And so what I want you to do, this map should have been in the beginning, and I had another map in the beginning, but just to show you the true size. Africa is distorted on the world maps, and this is the true size. You can fit China, the US, Spain, Germany, India, Eastern Europe, basically. You can fit Great Britain, you can fit Japan, Italy. All those countries fit inside of Africa. That's how vast Africa is. And so a lot of times, those maps, well, all the time, those maps are distorted. And people don't have a true sense of the size of Africa. And that's the size of the US imposed on West Africa. And again, the reason I included this is because, just to give you a little bit, this country of Guinea was one of the countries that staged a coup d'etat. Again, there's Mali, a little bit of Mali sticking out of there. Niger, and Burkina Faso, and then down here you have Gabon, and again you have Chad, you have Central African Republic. And so what they're doing, which comes to the third part of this book a little bit, is about, I just want you to get a size of the scale and scope of the countries that have thrown out France that are talking about forming a federation. Those countries that are talking about coming together. And so those countries are about the size, roughly, of the United States. And so they, when combined, and they're also talking about Mauritania, which is also a French-speaking country, joining that as well. And so when you talk about a country the size of the United States with that amount of resources, that's a game changer. That's a game changer globally. I just want you to keep that in mind too. And so again, everything that was in blue was basically colonized by the French. Everything in red was colonized by the British. What is in orange was the personal property of King Leopold of Belgium. And so, but it is French speaking as well. So you can really put the orange with the blue. And that is France, everything that France controlled in Africa. Just to give you an idea. And that's why it's important. That's why they want to continue to dominate. That is an enormous market for French goods. They don't want to give that. And I think that would conclude my slides. And so, Brother Amdar said we're going to do a Q&A session.
Yes, sir.
All right, and so I'm ready for your Q&A, for the Q&A session. And again, I thank you for listening.
My question is, knowing all of